Hello, everyone. It's a beautiful day outside, which is one of the more cheery things I can think to say right now. So, thank you for joining us for this discussion of the future of U.S. climate and environmental science funding. My name is Peter Hybers, and I'm the chair of the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, which is sponsoring this event. To put it mildly, these are difficult, unusual times for the sciences at Harvard and within the U.S. in general. In some ways, these times are especially difficult for the climate and environmental sciences. And the landscape of cuts and different cancellations that is occurring is evolving rapidly. The numbers that I wrote down a couple days ago are actually no longer quite relevant. But we'll hear more about this from our experts. I'm hard-pressed to think of people who could better help us make sense of how current funding cuts are transpiring and what they portend for the future of U.S. climate and environmental science funding than the three people who will be joining us on the stage here. I'm going to make brief introductions because full ones would exhaust the hour. John Holdren is research professor in Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and emeritus faculty member in the Harvard Kennedy School, in our Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. John has served on government advisory roles throughout his career. In the 1990s, he served on President Clinton's President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, and then served as President Obama's science advisor, co-chair of PCAST, and director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House for 8 years, from 2009 through 2017. I might mention that during 2012 through 2013, I had the honor of working under him at OSTP. Maria Zuber joins us from down the road. She is the E.A. Griswold Professor of Geophysics and Presidential Advisor for Science and Technology Policy at MIT, and served as MIT's Vice President for Research from 2013 to 2024, overseeing major research initiatives at MIT, as well as MIT Lincoln Laboratory. In 2013, President Obama appointed Maria to the National Science Board, which provides oversight and establishes policies for the National Science Foundation. She was reappointed to this position by President Trump, and served as board chair from 2016 to 2018. In 2021, President Biden named Maria co-chair of PCAST, where she helped guide national science and technology policy. Dan Schrag, who also served on PCAST for 8 years during the Obama administration, will moderate the conversation. He is the Sturgis Hooper Professor of Geology, Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering at Harvard University, and co-director of the Science, Technology, and Public Policy Program at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at HKS. So Dan, let me hand this over to you to moderate our conversation, please.
So as Peter says, these are very difficult times. I was trying to compile the latest numbers on budget cuts to science agencies, and it's hard to do it because it's changing in real time. Yesterday or 2 days ago, another 700 NSF grants were canceled. Not clear whether that's legal or not, but we'll get into that maybe a little bit. That's 1,100 in the last 4 days. And the proposed budget cut from the White House for NSF is a 55% budget cut plus a 50% staff cut, just to give you the sense of scale. At NASA, it's almost the same. NASA Science's proposed cut goes from $7.3 billion down to $3.9 billion. That's a 47% cut or something like that, 46%. At NOAA, I think maybe because it's so closely related to climate, it's even worse. OAR, the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Wing of NOAA, which is basically like NOAA Science, budget going from $485 million down to $170 million, a 65% cut. And so basically any aspect of these organizations, if you're doing something related to climate, the likelihood that the numbers are going to get worse. For example, our friend Gavin Schmidt, who's the head of NASA GISS, the modeling group from NASA in New York City, they have been turned out of their building. So now that 100% of the GISS team is working remotely because NASA has canceled their rental contract on their building. I think it's just a matter of time before the whole team is turned away. So in these times, Peter Hybers and I thought it would be very interesting to listen to John and Maria talk a little bit about the way science funding actually normally works, because I actually think it's important to put what's going on now in perspective. None of us here can predict what the Trump administration is going to do next, but I think it is interesting to hear a little bit about how things worked, and especially perhaps from Maria, who served as on the National Science Board during the first Trump administration. In fact, as one of the co-chairs.
One chair.
Oh, one chair. You're full chair.
Full chair.
Yeah.
Co-chair of PCAST.
Co-chair of PCAST, but chair of the National Science Board. So John, let's start with you. You've looked at the numbers. You're watching all of these numbers. You want to give people, because a lot of the students here don't have a perspective on how these numbers are actually set, at least in the old days. You were at OSTP, which in some ways was a central clearinghouse for a lot of these numbers.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about how these budgets for these different programs within the agencies?
Yeah, let me just say a few words about that, because the budget process is very complicated. I could take up the whole time going on, but I won't do that. But the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House is co-responsible with the Office of Management and Budget for shaping the budget the president submits to Congress for the science and technology dimensions of the president's budget. And the way that is done, and I should pause to say, for all the other aspects of the president's budget, the operation in charge in the White House is the Office of Management and Budget. But the way that is done is in close interaction with the departments and agencies with science and technology responsibilities. What happens is the OMB director and the director of OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, produce a letter to the cabinet secretaries, the office heads, the agency heads, every year, well in advance of when the president's budget has to be submitted to the Congress. And in that letter, signed by both the OMB director and the OSTP director, the president's priorities that he would like to see reflected, at least reflected in the budgets of the departments and agencies, are set forth. The departments and agencies can submit to the White House whatever budgets they want, but they all understand that if they at least reflect some of the president's priorities in their proposal, they'll probably do better in the ultimate outcome. Then what happens is there's a long process in which representatives of the departments and agencies interact with the staff of OMB and the OSTP to arrive at a tentative budget for the president's consideration. And after that, the final step is there's a meeting between the president's chief of staff, the OMB director, and the OSTP director, just four of us in the room, to talk about what the president thinks he wants to do, whether the OMB director and the OSTP director have any suggestions for changing what he thinks he wants to do, and that finalizes the science and technology budget. That then, of course, goes to the Congress, and the Congress is under no obligation to fund what the president's budget requests. And quite often they don't. Quite often they reduce some items, they increase some items, but the Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse under the Constitution. And so the president proposes, but the Congress disposes. And of course, what we have been seeing lately is not that at all. In fact, it has already been made quite clear in the press that many cabinet secretaries are unhappy at the extent to which they've been left out of the process. The DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, has been determining, in many cases unilaterally, what things it thinks ought to be cut. And that's often what happens next. And then the cabinet secretaries come back and they complain to Elon Musk about things that are particularly egregious, and sometimes those are reversed. That's one of the reasons that, as Dan noted, it's very difficult to say at any given moment what the overall situation is, because some things have been reversed that were announced previously. Some things are in the process of being reversed. But overall, it's clear from the number of departures and from the number of projects that have been stopped that there has already been great damage done, which, as I think we'll talk about soon, will be difficult to reverse. And as you don't change these things overnight after the people have left The projects have been closed down, the teams have dispersed, and some of the damage that's already been done, I believe, will last not just for years, some of it will last for decades, including the discouragement of young people in substantial numbers from going into science and technology, or from if they've already gone into science and technology, leaving this country for greener pastures.
Now, Maria, before your time on PCAST, you had a lot of experience at NASA because you're a planetary scientist, but you were also chair of the National Science Board, and that really runs NSF. And NSF has always been a little bit more insulated from the political winds than other agencies. You want to give us a sort of NSF perspective on this?
Sure. So NSF is the major funder of non-biomedical fundamental research in the country, and they have managed to stay out of the fray. And NSF is unique in the sense that it has fiduciary oversight. So the National Science Board is 25 members plus the NSF director, okay, who collectively oversee the board of directors of the NSF, okay. So when and I should also say that while I was chair of the National Science Board, Franz Cordova was the director of NSF, and actually we had a great partnership and a pretty similar worldview about how to navigate things. And so when President Trump was elected, it was a surprise to many, I think. And
in 2016,
in 2016, first time, yeah. It was a surprise to many, and so the question arose: well, what are we going to do about this? And the answer was quite obvious. The president was duly elected by the people of the United States, and that we were going to sit down and try to figure out what the priorities of the Trump administration were, where science, technology, and STEM education could play a role. And then we were going to interact with the White House and do everything that we could to advance those goals, because it would be good for NSF, good for the country. We were there to try to serve the country. And it worked out, actually, okay. There were people in the White House that were strongly conservative but very good, that you could reach out to and that you could talk to and that you could have quiet conversations with. And good people would get nominated to the National Science Board. Good people would get nominated to head certain offices, and things worked out okay. In spite of the kind of broader, I'll say, general disruption that is the president's style. That's his leadership style. Now, John talked about the process of developing a letter that provides budget guidance to the agencies, and so the first budget guidance that NSF received from in the first Trump administration was for a 30% across the board cut. Okay, and so the National Science Board is required to approve the budget submission that NSF makes to Congress. Okay, and the other thing that you should all understand here is that the agencies are obligated to develop a budget that is consistent with the guidance from the White House. So
So you were basically told to pass this 30% budget.
30% budget cut through, and so this was a problem because the agency had no recourse but to develop a budget like this, and the National Science Board, the members were not going to vote for a 30% cut in the NSF budget because, Well, for obvious reasons, they were not going to, because it's not good for America. And so what I came up with was I asked the director, I asked France to develop 3 budgets. Okay, one budget that reflected the guidance from OMB, a stay the course budget that was essentially like last year's budget with maybe a slight inflation increase, and then a Make America Great Again budget that, if we made these additional investments, would be fantastic for competitiveness for the country. And that if NSF developed these 3 budgets, the board would vote on the collective package and they could make that submission to Congress. So that's what we did.
Wow.
And what came back, and of course, as John noted, the budget guidance from OMB and OSTP reflects the president's priorities, and it is usually the starting point for negotiations in Congress. And but the appropriators determine what the numbers are, and actually what came back to NSF was very close to the stay the course budget, was actually a little higher. So that happened the last time. So there are ways to work within the system, but this very much required that Congress did its job of looking at the budget and making determinations. You know, everything has to be justified and everything should be justified, but I thought that the NSF team did a really great job of justifying the budget that was sent to Capitol Hill.
So John, you worked with a hostile Congress for 6 of the 8 Obama years, but you understood how the appropriations process worked for science because you were overseeing that whole process. Do you see that as possible now? Are there? I mean, there should be a lot of supporters of science in Congress, right?
There have been a lot of supporters, and I think there still are deep in their hearts. But this Congress is much different than the Congress that I worked with and the Congress that Maria worked with, in that the Congress is now afraid. Lisa Murkowski, senator from Alaska, Republican, recently gave a speech in which she said, "We're all afraid. We're all scared to death. They're all afraid of Trump." And what we saw in the Obama administration and what was seen subsequently in the first Trump administration and in the Biden administration is not something we can now rely upon. We can't rely upon, I think, Congress rising to its responsibilities. Again, congressional responsibility includes the power of the purse. They're supposed to be the appropriators. And in previous administrations, they have carried out that function, albeit not typically in a timely fashion. That is, very often the Congress fails to approve a budget on the proper schedule, and sometimes you're stuck with a continuing resolution where things simply stay as they were last year. But we cannot any longer rely on the proposition that if the president makes preposterous proposals in his budget submission, which seems likely given all the things they've been doing without authority from the Congress at all, I don't think we can count on this Congress to act as previous Congresses have done and overrule that. I hope I'm wrong. I have, in my writings about the current situation, argued that we desperately need not only intervention from the courts to determine with clarity what is legal and not legal about what the president has been doing already, but we also need a sufficient number of Republican members of Congress to develop a spine, to stand up and act on the recognition that their oath of office to defend the Constitution and defend the American people is a higher priority than their worries about what Trump might do to punish them.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that. So right now, all the oxygen in Congress is being consumed on the reconciliation bill, okay? Which doesn't include any of the agency budgets. So the reconciliation bill is a mechanism that allows bills that relate directly to the budget to pass with a simple majority. Okay, there can be no filibuster. It can, pass the House with 51 votes. So the actual rest of the budget, which includes the science agency budgets, is going to require 60 votes to pass. Okay, that's going to be a tough road to hoe in the current divided Congress. And so the possibility of yet another continuing resolution, I think, has to be on the table. And we used to hate continuing resolutions, but now it could be, the best possible outcome for us in the short term, because in continuing resolution, you get the same budget that you got for the previous year, and it is supposed to be spent in the same way that it was spent the year before. So you technically can't redirect large parts of that budget to do something else other than what it was used for in the previous year. Although we'll have to see what happens. But you should all realize that that's a possibility here, and we don't know.
That's actually incredibly good news that the agency budgets are not going to be part of the reconciliation.
No.
Because then it would only take 50
the only thing that affects universities that is part of the reconciliation bill is the endowment tax, which is not the topic of today's
Right.
discussion, but that's the only university-related thing.
But again, I would hate to temper that good news a little bit, but again, what the Trump administration has already been doing in rescinding already obligated funds, canceling grants that are already out there, decimating the staffs of the agencies that have to make the decisions, that have to distribute the money. We really are going to need more than a reconciliation bill. We're going to need, or more than a continuing resolution. We're going to need the courts to step in and prevent actions that are not, in fact, constitutional.
So let's drill down a little on climate science across the agencies, because it's interesting. I would have predicted after DEI that this was going to be their first attack. But it's funny, NIH was first. I guess his hatred of Tony Fauci and infectious disease research was greater than climate science. But it feels like climate science, well, it's at least partly happened, but it's still, I feel like the hammer still hasn't fallen. At NOAA, OAR decimated.
Yeah.
Within NASA, picking on NASA GIST, which is a tiny little organization, it's not that much. But we haven't seen the really big hits.
Yeah, and we're not so sure about what's going to happen at NASA. So besides the GIST part, the Earth science budget is in the science budget, along with astrophysics, planetary science, heliophysics, and so it's not clear how, and the Nancy Grace Roman Observatory, big things like the James Webb Space Telescope are in that part of the budget, and how all of that gets allocated.
So if they really were, again, if Congress were to actually pass the budget, it doesn't seem likely they would embrace the full 45% budget cut for NASA science.
I can't say, just for the same reasons that John. I wish I had a crystal ball. In the past, that wouldn't have happened. That the NASA science budget had pretty strong support. The one thing that I can tell you is that the science budget is a separate line item from the human spaceflight part of the budget. So you can't move money between the human spaceflight budget and the science budget or the aeronautics budget or the technology development budget. So there are, I will say, I wouldn't call them firewalls, but guardrails that you just can't, impermeable boundaries that you can't move funding across.
That the NASA administrator can't just choose to move
Correct.
things around.
Correct.
So Dan, I want to
Yeah.
come in on the topic of NOAA for a moment. NOAA is apparently on a course to dismantle its research operation. EPA is dismantling its research operation. At NOAA, they've already cut a lot of the data-centered operations. They are talking about terminating the lease on Mauna Loa in Hawaii, where the Keeling curve is maintained, of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They have already fired a lot of people with science responsibilities. Even if the Congress had a sudden attack of good sense, it will be difficult for NOAA to recover from what has already been done in the space related to climate change. I think the same thing is going to be true with EPA. They have also, just in the last few days, commenced to dismantle the U.S. Global Change Research Program. The USGCRP is a consortium of, when I was there, was 13 departments and agencies. I'm not sure, it's not 14 now. But it has typically operated at a level of $2.5 to $2.7 or $2.8 billion a year, in which the agencies collaborate on projects, tasks, programs associated with global environmental change. Those have included the U.S. Assessment, the National Assessment of Climate Change Impacts on the United States. They have just told everybody who was working on the current version, supposed to come out every 4 years, sometimes it's delayed beyond that. It's indispensable for states, regions, mayors who have to make choices about climate change adaptation. It's indispensable to them because it works to disaggregate what climate change is doing in different parts of the country, different regions, and in different economic sectors. It's just going away. Again, it may be that with philanthropic funding, people will resurrect a national climate assessment. I suspect that probably will happen. But the damage being done simply by dismantling the current operation is considerable.
Well, if you look at the official White House page on the origins of the COVID coronavirus, if you think of that analogy for what the national climate assessment might look like, it's pretty grim.
Uh,
But we're not going to get one at all out of this government. I mean, that's now clear. They've dismantled it.
Yeah.
So-
I mean, I'm actually a little surprised that the emphasis, at least on adaptation, isn't being continued because of
Yeah.
how significantly it impacts local communities. What's quite puzzling is that if you, there's a great map actually that University of Pennsylvania put together on the impacts of the NIH cuts, and it's the entire country. It isn't limited to the Northeast and the West Coast. I mean, it's just impacting all states, all communities, and so it's hard to imagine that this isn't going to be noticed.
So
at some
what
point.
about so there's lots of economic analysis that shows how the economy significantly slows when we don't invest in science.
New report in the New York Times today on that.
Yes.
Exactly.
It's a
that
group from
topic.
American University, I think.
right.
But
Yeah.
there's lots and lots of
Yeah,
other studies
course.
that show similar things. What about the international component of this? What about the competitiveness part? Feels like, there are three major climate modeling groups in the US. One, NASA GISS, GFDL, NOAA, and then NCAR, NSF. It feels like all three of them may be gone within a year. Don't know, but that's certainly plausible given the trend that we're seeing now. what does that do for U.S. in terms of the international arena? We were talking about China, but it's more than China. It's China, it's Europe, it's really a global concern about talent, data, information.
Yeah, well, it's just been announced actually that the office in the State Department that handles international science agreements is closing at the end of June, I believe. And this, this affects CERN, ITER, the global consortiums for atmospheric data, weather data, and it, unless agreements aren't on auto renew, they would have to be picked up by another office within the State Department to negotiate them. So the even for U.S. scientists who have privately funded work, their ability to get a hold of international data sets that they would use in their global models, I think, are potentially at risk here.
Yeah, let me make a further comment about that. When I was in office in the Obama administration, the United States had 46 bilateral science and technology agreements with other countries. 6 of them were so-called ministerial level agreements. Those are with Brazil, China, India, Japan, Russia, and South Korea. And the other 40 were operated at a level below the level of ministers of other countries. The ministerial level ones were overseen by the OSTP director, me, and the Minister of Science or the Minister of Science and Technology in the partner countries. The other 40 were managed by the State Department with OSTP support. The 6 ministerial were managed by OSTP with State Department support. So the State Department was involved in all of them, and the State Department office was important to all of them. And this is, frankly speaking, another disaster that the State Department is shutting that down. Now, we have no notion at this point of what the OSTP is doing with respect to science and technology cooperation agreements. There has been an individual nominated to be the President's Science Advisor and OSTP Director, Michael Kratsios. Kratsios is a bright, youngish guy, but he has a BS in political science from Princeton, no science credentials at all, knows something about technological entrepreneurship, which is a domain in which he's worked, but has no standing and no deep knowledge about science. Very hard to tell.
Well, he's been confirmed now. So
he's been confirmed.
He's
So maybe pretty soon we'll find out what he intends to do. But
well, his I believe his first major policy talk will be mid-May.
Good.
So we'll find that out. I will say that so he was chief technology officer during
First Trump.
Trump administration, and the OSTP director, who turned out to be Kelvin Drogemeyer, wasn't appointed until 2.5 years in.
They approached a number of people first.
So
he turned them down.
Michael was kind of the only game in town in terms of a contact, and he was very supportive of NSF.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he came to every NSF event. He was extremely supportive of NSF's priorities. I can't say what he's going to do or not do in the current administration, but he was he was an NSF supporter.
Yeah, I think he was better than expected in a lot of respects in the first Trump administration. But what's unclear is what he's going to be committed to now and what he's going to be allowed to do now, given Trump's evident antipathy to science and to international cooperation.
So we're going to transition in a minute to questions from the audience, because I know people have a lot of questions for the two of you. But I wanted to ask you, before we turn to them, if you were advising heads of major research organizations, institutes, presidents of universities, et cetera, hypothetically, how do you get through? I mean, given what's coming, what's the strategy for both survival and recovery? John said some of these things will last 10 years or decades. I don't know how you build a GFDL or an NCAR back if you really fire everybody and send them all packing. That doesn't seem easily reversed. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about from the level of individual scientists to this level of university presidents. How do you think about what's going on here? Do you think about it as a transient, or do you think about it as a new normal and start to adapt? I'd love to know what you're thinking about.
I'd love to know what Maria is thinking.
Well, that assumes I'm capable of higher thought here. But so the first thing I'll say is it is incorrect to think that 2 years from now, after the midterms, or 4 years from now, all this is going to go away and things are going to go back to the way they were, okay? Because things never go back. Decisions are made, and it's not going to go back to the same place. One of the questions that I asked right at the beginning of when I went to do PCAST, I asked Eric Lander, has there ever been a study on how much research the government should fund? Okay. And what's the right amount? What's the right percentage of GDP? Okay, it was what it was during the Apollo program, and that turned out okay until it went away. But how do we justify that it has to be this level versus that level? And I think now it's a time to go back and really think about this, because the country is going to lose things based on what's happening now, and there will be a rebuilding. Foundations and industry, on the basis of what they fund in universities now. So let's just take industry. Industry basically funds itself. Okay, 3% of the funding that industry spends on R&D goes to universities. So if they doubled that or tripled that, it's still, is a drop in the bucket in comparison to what the government funds in universities. And foundations are even a lower fraction. And plus the fact that, industry tends to fund things that are applied. 70% of foundation funding is biomedical, and the overwhelming percentage of it is disease specific. So
there's no great safety net coming from industry.
We can't.
Foundations.
Obviously everybody's going to be thinking about industry and foundations, but on the basis of what gets funded now, even if that were to greatly increase, that would not take the place of government funding, particularly in the basic science area. So there's going to have to be a new rebuilding, and there will be. Okay, I'm very optimistic that there will be a rebuilding, and we're going to have to think about these questions. I think about when the whole idea of the government university partnership in supporting research was started. It was, wow, we helped win the Second World War, and wow, look at what it did for the U.S. economy and economic competitiveness and national security. And so economic competitiveness and national security are the two drivers here. And so, much as all of us who do basic research love to look at a problem on the basis of the beauty of the problem, and wouldn't it be fantastic if we know what the answer is, that's not why the government is funding it. Okay, and so I think we've got to start now thinking about building the case for where we need to get to. We ought to think about where we want to be. Okay, and I'll tell you, if you just said we want to be back to where we are now, that hasn't been justified by any study that I've seen that it should be that number.
Well, so it's interesting, right?
Yeah.
Presidents of universities for the last several decades, major thought leaders in science, haven't been going around giving talks to the public about why the public should be funding science. We've sort of taken it for granted. And doing it now in a hurry, the New York Times article today about why science funding is so important for the economy, it feels a little rushed and a little late.
Dan, I want to
party.
take a slightly different
Yeah.
spin on a couple of these things. The first is we do have to do a better story of telling why investing in basic research is in the public interest and not just a thing we do for scientists so that they can entertain themselves. We need to tell the story that basic research is the seed corn from which future applied advances come. The difficulty with basic research is because it's basic, because it's fundamental, you can't predict which efforts are going to yield economically important results. But the fact is, basic research led to the laser, basic research led to GPS, basic research led to Google, basic research in a dozen different ways enabled cell phones. You couldn't predict when that research was being done that it was going to have these enormous effects. But it's absolutely essential that the public understand that the government's funding of basic research, precisely for the reason that Maria said, that private industry is never going to fund enough of that because it is too uncertain in terms of what the outcome is going to be, who's going to benefit from the outcome, how long it's going to take, which basic research problems are going to yield big benefits. But we absolutely know from history that basic research yields enormous returns to the society. And we've got to tell that story better.
Now, who gets to tell that story? I mean, do you think all of us need to step up and start telling it? Do we need to call
Yes.
out our
Yes.
academic leaders to do it in a bigger way?
Well, we all need to be part of that story.
Yes, the motto of one of the first big demonstrations, Stand Up for Science, I think is exactly right. Everybody who has a story that they could tell should stand up for science. But I want to say one more thing, because Maria made an interesting point about maybe there's never been a study of how big research funding should be. We actually did in the Clinton administration and then again in the Obama administration, a number of studies looking at parts of that. We looked very hard at funding for energy.
Yep.
And we said, there are a lot of ways you can tell how much you should be spending on energy. One is what are the size of the opportunities that are going unfunded at the moment. Number two is what is the pace at which indicators of how well the energy system is doing are improving. And if that's not good enough to meet society's goals, including, for example, addressing climate change, then you should be spending more money. There have been a number of studies over the years that have tried in various ways to figure this out.
Little parts of it.
It's not as if nobody's been worried about that, but it is a very hard question to answer on the whole. And by the way, the one more thing I wanted to say is Obama did give a number of public speeches talking specifically about why we need more basic research. But you need a lot more than the president talking, although having the president talking is very
Certainly
helpful.
is a very helpful
and it's
thing.
the opposite of what we have now. The president talks, but not in the right direction.
So I suspect there are lots of questions in the audience. We have microphones somewhere, is that right? Great. So raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you because it is being recorded. If you could just say who you are and keep your question relatively brief, but the floor is open. Anyone? Don't be shy.
Stunned silence.
Yeah, in the center here.
Hi, I'm Ashley. I'm a PhD student at MIT. I study climate science. And I guess you asked about like what advice you'd have for maybe a university president sort of addressing these issues. I wonder what advice you have for a young person, a PhD student in undergrad, kind of entering this field and how we should be thinking about adapting our careers, or what skills do we need to be building to kind of live in this new reality.
Question.
My advice may be different from Maria's, but my advice is stay the course. Particularly if you're a PhD student at MIT in climate science, you're going to get an interesting and rewarding job, for sure. Exactly where it will be, whether it will be government funded, foundation funded, industry funded, or in another country, you're going to be able to work on the enormous challenges that climate change poses. And I would say, therefore, stay the course.
Yeah, well, my advice is kind of similar with a little bit of a different twist. You know, all of us in this room, we are so fortunate to be scientists because science is just a fantastic field. You know, you wake up every day and you discover something new, and how many people have that kind of satisfaction to really understand the joy of discovery? And, you know, it used to be, like until extremely recently, that there were very well-established pathways if you were getting a degree in some scientific field. And you could say, all right, well, maybe, you know, I don't want to do research, so I want to go work for a consulting company, or I do want to become a researcher, or, you know, I might want to do field work for some private organization. And I would say the landscape now, those pathways are not at all clear, okay? But we're going to need to do more muscle memory and develop new pathways. And, you know, out of chaos comes opportunity. And so things are not going to go probably the way that you envisioned when you decided to go to grad school. But there are going to be things to do. And goodness knows, in the world of climate science, we need all the smart minds that we can get thinking about this problem in many different ways. And there's going to be new ways to think about these problems.
I would also say that there may be new skills that your generation will develop that our generations have had to develop. But specifically, you know, I learned to write grants to NSF by a lot of failures, right? And you iterate and you learn and you improve, and eventually you figure out how to get it done. Those opportunities may be reduced, and therefore learning how to get money from foundations, private foundations or private individuals, may be new skills that most climate scientists haven't had to bother with, but may be more essential to future success than ever before. I'm not sure that's a good thing. In my experience, individuals and private foundations can be whimsical and relationship-based and feels much more arbitrary than an NSF panel or a NIH study group. But that may be the way our field evolves. I don't know. Other questions? Please.
Hi, thank you. My name's Jack. I'm a PhD student here doing modeling work in the Jacob Group. My question is regarding data. So the federal government, particularly like the U.S. government, and U.S. science has produced an enormous and rich archive of a variety of remote sensing data, in situ data, all of that. And obviously the loss of these collection sites like Mauna Loa is a big loss. But I also worry about the loss of these data archives. And I'm curious if you could speak to, you know, how founded is that anxiety? Is there a worry that we're going to lose access to or even see the deletion of large archives of data? And what can we do to kind of combat that?
Well, there are sites set up that have copied over the archives. So those archive data sets exist and will continue to exist.
Yeah, there are organizations that were actually set up in 2016.
Yeah.
So there was a fear of this in 2016 before Trump took office in 2017. And whether every bit of data is being scrubbed, and I don't know, but there are a lot of people who are thinking about that. But it's not just data. Data is a part of it, but a lot of it's the instruments too. Think of all of the NOAA instruments and NASA instruments that are being developed, that are used for atmospheric aircraft flights and various other things. When they shut some of these government labs down, that equipment's going to get mothballed. If we're lucky, it might be usable someday in the future, but possibly it'll just get junked. That's probably, I don't know, Frank Koich probably has a better estimate of this, but it's probably overall across NASA and NOAA, it's probably hundreds of millions of dollars of past effort to create those instruments. What do you think, Maria? It's a huge number.
It's a big number, yeah.
Yeah. So it's data, but it's also the hardware too.
While we're waiting for the next one,
Robin.
to say, I too am not confident that every last important data set has been captured, but the work does continue, and there are a number of energetic and to some degree well-funded organizations trying to work that problem.
Go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, I just wanted to probe on this point of philanthropy stepping in, and I think you've made it clear that that's not going to be anything like a full solution, but I'm still curious what your thoughts are about philanthropists who have given in the past, the likelihood that they may step up in the future and at least partially cover some of the problems we're seeing.
We were talking about this a little bit among ourselves ahead of the meeting. There certainly is significant potential in philanthropies to cover at least some of the gaps that the government is creating. It's true that philanthropy, either private or public or both of them together, don't have enough money to remotely cover everything that the government is discarding. But they can do a lot, they can do more. The trouble is several-fold. One is the big foundations are all, like the Congress, scared. They're scared that Trump will go after their tax status. And Trump has explicitly threatened on a couple of occasions to do just that. And that, I suspect, will make foundations particularly reluctant to step into gaps that the federal government is leaving where Trump has made it clear that he hates the activity. Like he hates climate change activity, he hates climate science, he hates windmills, for heaven's sakes. So it remains to be seen whether the foundations will become thoroughly intimidated by that possibility. The other problem, of course, is the multiplicity of ways in which the federal government's actions have increased the potential demand on foundations. That is, scientists who've lost their jobs in government are joining other entities that are going to be applying to foundations to support them. The incumbent researchers who have long been supported by foundations are going to find it more difficult to continue their support because of the increased competition from the effects of the Trump administration. So it's going to be tough. And the foundations, I think, are going to do a lot of useful things. It's not going to be remotely enough, but I'm hoping particularly that Trump's capacity to punish organizations that take actions he doesn't like is going to be diminished by the courts. That has to be our hope.
Just to remind you of scale, though, we're talking about $9 billion for NSF. So that's if they really do a 55% budget cut, that's about a $5 billion deficit right there. We heard $3.4 billion out of NASA's science budget, another $500 million out of NOAA. I mean, the numbers are huge, and we haven't talked about DOE yet, but they're big numbers. Frank, go ahead.
Just to add a cheery note onto what John was saying about the challenges for foundations and philanthropy, climate isn't the only thing. So some people are saying because of the cut of AID, the money we have, we're going to shift from climate and put it into directly saving people's lives. So there's also additional, you've got to imagine the NIH cuts and health cuts are huge. And so some people are now deciding whether to fund for climate, which is perhaps more of a long-term thing, or try to short-term save people's lives. And it's hard to argue against that.
I think I've got to say, my own view, and I'd love to hear what you guys think, is that setting that up is is just a false dichotomy. It's a false choice. That may be true, but the idea that we have to choose between, $4.5 billion out of NSF's basic science or $500 million out of NOAA versus what USAID does, without looking at the entire federal budget, is ridiculous. That's just the height of it's a false comparison.
But Dan, this comes back to the point we were talking about at the beginning. We once had a much more systematic, analysis-based approach to deciding what to fund for the government. Foundations as a group, of course, are very diverse. They don't have a single systematic structure for deciding across the foundations what we're all going to do in proportion to the importance of different issues. Foundations tend to fund what they know. They tend to fund what they know how to do. And we're certainly going to have a big challenge getting foundations to do what the government no longer does in terms of systematic analysis of priorities and where you put the money.
Sure. I mean, we saw this with Gates, right? Bill Gates basically said, I'm backing away from climate because I've got to put everything on to global health.
Yeah. Well, I'm a big fan of a balanced portfolio because you just don't know where the next big direction is going to be. So, nuclear fell out of favor in DOE, and many university departments cut out their nuclear engineering departments. MIT didn't. That's where Commonwealth Fusion came from. And so you got to be really careful when you say that something isn't important anymore.
Yeah.
So.
We're sort of at time, but I wanted to end, Peter, with one last question for the two of you, which is, I know it's as Niels Bohr supposedly once said, prediction is difficult, especially about the future. It's also credited to Yogi Berra. But any predictions for how this is all going to go over the coming year? I hate to ask beyond that because...
Well, we're going to be living in 4 years of disruption. I think after the midterms, at least the House will probably go Democratic, and there'll be a lot of sand in the gears of, just all the decisions that are being made very quickly and being implemented. And as John said, the court decisions will come in. So the
hence this discussion of impoundment and precision is going to be even more important.
Yeah, I think the pace that we're seeing now won't be maintained. But as John said pretty clearly, we're just not going to be able to snap back and go back to business. It's we're going to have to plan for a new future, and we got to make sure that that's going to be a great future.
I would just add to that, and I know Maria agrees with this, we can't really wait for the midterms. The midterms might do us some good with the House shifting, and conceivably even the Senate if Trump does enough damage to everybody's interests in between. But we really need the courts to step up in the meantime to try to cut off the most egregious violations of the Constitution and existing law. We need to do everything we can to persuade at least a couple of handful of Republican members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, to oppose the kinds of activities that so egregiously violate everything the country is supposed to stand for. If we don't do that, if we cannot succeed, both with getting some stronger resistance out of the Congress and with getting the courts to reach some good decisions and find ways to enforce them, I don't think we can be sure that the midterms will be what they ought to be. Because the guardrails are disappearing so rapidly that it's hard to be sure that if midterms occur at all, they will be fairly counted.
Well, that's a very dark view of the future.
Sorry.
I know that John and Maria would be happy to talk with people informally afterwards for a little bit. But Peter, you want to close us off?
Let me offer my own thanks for your perspective and wisdom in what's really some difficult and uncertain times. It's really helpful to be able to come together as a community and dwell on some of these things. In what ways do we need to be creative and resilient going forward? Is so much of the question we need to all be asking ourselves. But join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you, Dan, for the